Hello, I am Andrew Klopfenstein, and I'm here today to talk about our eFields study in pinch row compaction, specifically in corn. I am a senior research engineer here in the Department of Food, Agriculture, and Biological Engineering. And this study, there's multiple studies, and you can find these on pages 66 through 71 in the eFields document. So the objective when we set out several years ago on this study, this is a multi-year study, we were looking at ways to evaluate utilizing tracks on different planters to reduce soil compaction on yield in corn. So when we look specifically at different track types, we had two specific vendors we've been working with, and that is Camzo Manufacturing and Susi Track have been supporting this project. So when we look at the study design for 2019, the focus of our work was on planter tracks and tires, not on the tractor traction devices for 2019. In past years, if you look at our studies, we have looked at different devices on the tractor. So we used OSU Plots app to lay out a complete randomized block design for execution in our field scale studies. And then these investigations on 2019 tracks was completed with multiple brands of tractors and planters. So when we look at pinch row compaction, we are looking at the center 6 rows of the planter. Whether this is an 8-row planter or a 24-row planter, we are specifically looking at these center 6 rows. So I have it laid out here in front of us as rows 1 through 16, and we would be looking specifically at rows 6 through 11 for that pinch row effect. And in the image below would be the typical field scene that we would see if we would go out and do scouting. We would see the corn, quote, waving or going through the field having highs and lows, and that is from that pinch row effect. So in 2019, as most of us are aware, we had quite a few weather issues, as can be seen, and this presented many opportunities for planting to be done at less than optimal conditions. But as we got later in the growing season, there were still some conditions in which they were dry. So this was one location completed at the Molly Caron Ag Center in London, Ohio. And we could see from the field observations it was dry. In another location down by Circleville, Ohio, we had planting conditions that ranged from the top of knolls, which were very dry, to lower ground that was extremely wet. And this was very normal, obviously, for the 2019 growing season. And there were many fields that we were able to get across because we had tracks on the planter. And typically, we would not have been able to traverse the field with a wheeled planter. So here is a short clip of what we were all too familiar with from the 2019 growing season. And while we were planting this field, it was raining. Obviously, our conditions for optimal planting changed as we went through the growing season, as we got later and later, but we were able to complete planting passes with tracks on the planter. So here's another portion of video we were able to capture when we were planting in Circleville, Ohio. So obviously, we don't typically want to plant through this, but we did get that opportunity this past year. So field observations. When we went back to the field, this would be some typical observations. We would see if we would dig plants. This was actually from a couple years ago, digging pinch row rows. So if we went into those specific rows and pulled out plants, this obviously varies on soil type throughout the field. But you'll notice that the track picture here on the left had a much more developed root structure compared to the tired on the right. And notice the brace roots did not fully develop. So more field observations from 2019, we had slightly later than normal planting date, planting. And then the growing season itself was not bad in terms of early season condition, obviously very wet, but limited rainfall later in the year really was what was capping yield. That V4 to V6, we were able to observe moderate pinch row compaction that did follow through the rest of the growing season. We did notice slight differences in plant height. And then we did go out and pull some ears during the harvest portion. And if you notice on the right here, this was pulled specifically from the wheeled planter. The wheeled rows are on the left side, and then the non-pinch rows or the wing rows, which would be considered the control, are on the right. So obviously quite a bit of difference in yield when we're looking at that. So site one, this was done with a Case IH planter and tractor, and notice again we had quite a bit of rain in that early season, April, May, June, and then very little rain in July, August, and September, which is really what came back to cap the yield. So when we look at results, we have stand counts, and if we notice here at the pinch rows for tracks, there was a slight advantage, 29,000. 170 versus 29,000, but there was no statistical difference. And then when we look at yield, there was no statistical difference in yield. At site two, this was done with a John Deere planter and tractor. Again, very similar to that of the previous conditions, April, May, and June, high amounts of rainfall. July, August, and September, very little to no rainfall. So when we look at this site, we actually had more data, and we actually broke this out by different soil productivity units, or CPUs, crop productivity units. And as you look across this, you'll notice there wasn't a lot of difference between the tracked and wheeled planter in this growing season. So if you look 159 versus 157 overall, which was not statistically significant when we're looking at those comparisons. So conclusions, all data that was shown here is just the center 6 rows of the planter. Planters were all set to 75% seed capacity for this test, and whether that is the boxes were loaded to 75% or we put seed on there to simulate that, that is how we went about doing that. So when we look at return on investment, looking at price of corn for $3.50, if we aggregate the data from 2016 through 2018 for all soils, roughly a 4.2 bushel the acre increase. If we look at highly productive, 3.6 bushel the acre. If we look at medium productivity, we had 1 year less data there, just based off the fields that were used. We had a 10 bushel the acre increase in 2016 and 17. Low productivity, 8.2 bushels. So obviously, no soil is exactly the same, so it varies. So we have this chart here to the right, and obviously it varies quite a bit. I get this question a lot, no-till versus conventional. And obviously if you're running more conventional ground, there is a higher return on investment when we're looking at getting your money back for purchasing these tracks. So if you have any further questions, please email me. My email is on the screen, and we'd like to thank those that have been supporting this research, Camzo, Track, Susi Track, and Case IH.